The rain came down in sheets, hammering the cracked pavement of downtown Los Angeles. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows. It was the kind of night where even the most resilient soul sought shelter. But not Eleanor Carter. Ellie, as everyone called her, tugged her patched-up coat tighter around her frail frame. Her makeshift cart, loaded with scraps and her few belongings, squeaked as she pushed it into an alley for the night. She was used to this, the cold, the wet, the loneliness. After all, it had been 5 years since she lost everything. Her bakery, her husband, her home. Yet, through all the hardship, she'd held on to one thing, her compassion. Tonight, that compassion would be tested. As she spread a piece of tarp over a corner of the alley, her sharp ears picked up a sound, a low rustle, followed by a groan. She froze. People didn't usually come into her alley, and when they did, it wasn't good news. Gripping the handle of her cart, Ellie peered into the shadows. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. From the darkness, a figure emerged. A man, soaking wet and clutching his stomach, stumbled forward. His clothes, though filthy and torn, hinted at a life far removed from this grimy alley. His face was obscured by a layer of grime, and his disheveled hair clung to his forehead. Ellie's instincts screamed caution, but the moan of pain from the man silenced her hesitation. She stepped closer, squinting to get a better look. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softening. The man shook his head weakly. I just need a moment," he rasped, collapsing onto the wet ground. Ellie's heart clenched. The rain was unforgiving, and this man wouldn't last the night if left here. With surprising strength for her wiry frame, she heaved him under the cover of her tarp and wrapped him in one of her few blankets. "What's your name?" she asked, kneeling beside him. He hesitated, his eyes darting nervously before settling on her weathered face. "Ed, just Ed," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. "All right, Ed. I don't have much, but here," Ellie said, pulling a crust of bread from her cart. It was stale, but it was something. Ed stared at the bread, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he took it with trembling hands. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ellie chuckled, a sound as rough as the streets she lived on. "Because someone has to. Eat up. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." As Ed nibbled on the bread, Ellie settled against the wall, watching him. She had no idea who he truly was, nor the magnitude of the storm about to enter her life. And Ed, Elon Musk, the billionaire inventor and entrepreneur, had no idea that this homeless woman's kindness would soon change his world forever. If you were in Ellie's shoes, would you have stopped to help Ed? Or would you have walked away? Share your thoughts. The first rays of dawn crept into the alley, casting a faint golden glow over the city's forgotten corners. Ellie stirred awake, stretching her aching limbs. Beside her, Ed, still wrapped in the tattered blanket she'd given him, slept fitfully, his face occasionally twitching with discomfort. Ellie glanced at him and shook her head. Whoever this man was, he didn't belong here. His hands, though dirted by grime, lacked the calluses of someone accustomed to this life. His posture, even in exhaustion, hinted at a world far removed from alleyways and rain-soaked streets. Her stomach growled, pulling her attention away. She rummaged through her cart, finding half an apple she'd saved from the previous day. As she bit into it, her thoughts wandered to a time when breakfast wasn't a luxury. Years ago, Ellie Carter was a name known across her San Francisco neighborhood. Her bakery, Sweet Haven, was more than a business. It was a community landmark. Every morning, the aroma of fresh cinnamon rolls and sourdough bread wafted down the streets, drawing customers like bees to honey. Ellie loved her craft. She'd inherited the recipes from her grandmother, who taught her that baking wasn't just about ingredients, it was about heart. Customers didn't just buy bread. They bought comfort, a slice of home. Her husband, James, was her biggest cheerleader. He was the one who encouraged her to take the leap from catering small events to opening a storefront. Together, they worked tirelessly, pouring their savings into the business. For a while, life was sweet, just like her pastries. But life, Ellie learned, could turn bitter in an instant. It started with an electrical fire. One faulty wire in the bakery's aging oven sparked a blaze that consumed everything. Ellie had stepped out to make a delivery, and by the time she returned, the fire department was battling towering flames. The bakery was uninsured, a costly oversight they'd planned to address after the holiday rush. James took it the hardest. He blamed himself for not insisting they buy coverage earlier. The stress ate away at him, and 6 months later, he suffered a fatal heart attack. Ellie was left with nothing. The bills piled up. The few friends who offered help eventually grew distant, their own lives too demanding to accommodate her struggles. One by one, her possessions vanished, sold, pawned, or repossessed. When the bank foreclosed on her home, she packed a small bag and left. The streets became her reality, a harsh teacher that stripped away illusions and tested her will to survive. Ellie, the voice pulled her back to the present. She turned to see Ed sitting up, his expression groggy but alert. "Morning," she said, offering him a small smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better, I think," he replied, rubbing his temples. "Thanks for last night." Ellie shrugged. "You don't need to thank me. Everyone needs a hand sometimes." Ed studied her for a moment, as if trying to piece her together. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you?" She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the alley's entrance. "Long enough to know how it works. You keep your head down, share what you can, and hope tomorrow's a little kinder." There was a pause before Ed spoke again. "Why? Why help me when you barely have anything yourself?" Ellie chuckled, the sound tinged with both humor and resignation. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. Out here, most people walk past like you're part of the scenery. But everyone's got a story, Ed. Even you." Ed's lips tightened. "Yeah, well, my story's complicated." "So's mine," Ellie replied, standing up and brushing dirt off her coat. "But I don't need to know yours to see you needed help." She motioned for him to follow. "Come on. Let's see if the shelter's got anything left for breakfast. If you're lucky, they might have coffee." As they left the alley, Ed trailed behind, watching Ellie with newfound respect. He still hadn't revealed his identity, but one thing was clear. This woman, this homeless, resilient stranger, had a strength he envied. Have you ever faced a moment where everything seemed to fall apart? How did you find the strength to keep going? Share your story. The shelter wasn't much to look at. It sat in the shadow of a crumbling building, its peeling paint and broken windows a testament to the city's neglect of its most vulnerable citizens. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and stale food. A few other souls sat scattered around the room, wrapped in threadbare blankets or hunched over cups of what could loosely be called coffee. Ellie and Ed found a spot in the corner, away from the chatter and the cold stares. Ellie placed a hand on Ed's shoulder, guiding him toward a seat at a small metal table. He glanced around uneasily, unsure of what to make of his new surroundings. "You'll get used to it," Ellie said, as though she had memorized the rhythm of this place. "It's not glamorous, but it's food, and it's safe for the night." Ed nodded absently, his eyes scanning the room. "I've been in a lot of hotels, but this is different." Ellie snorted softly. "You think? There's no room service here, no soft sheets. Just people trying to get by. And sometimes that's all you can do." As they sat in silence, a new figure entered the shelter, his presence immediately catching Ed's attention. Tall, dressed in a sharp suit, he looked out of place in the run-down building. His eyes flicked from person to person, eventually landing on Ed. The man didn't approach immediately. Instead, he walked over to the corner, where a few others were gathered. Ellie caught the glance, noting the stranger's sharp movements, as if he were scanning the room for something or someone. "Who's that?" Ed asked in a low voice. Ellie followed his gaze. "That's Marcus. He's been around the city a while, keeps to himself mostly. Don't bother him, and he won't bother you." Ed nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Marcus's eyes had lingered on him longer than necessary, and Ed couldn't help but wonder if it was just coincidence. Ellie, sensing his unease, patted his arm reassuringly. "Don't worry. He's harmless." But as Ed watched Marcus leave the shelter a few hours later, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just the man's cold stare or his unsettling composure. It was the fact that Marcus had left without a word, his gaze still fixed on Ed as he stepped out into the night. Ellie had already settled into her corner of the alley when Ed joined her, looking more tense than before. "You all right?" Ellie asked, noticing the furrow in his brow. "I don't know," Ed replied, his voice distant. "Something about that guy, Marcus, doesn't sit right with me." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me you're scared of him now?" Ed shook his head, but there was no mistaking the doubt in his eyes. "No, it's not that. I've just got a bad feeling." Ellie chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Ed, this place isn't full of angels, but it's full of people trying to survive. Marcus is one of them. Don't let him get in your head." But as the night wore on, Ellie couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off either. She had been on the streets long enough to recognize when things were about to shift, when the calm was the quiet before a storm. Ellie and Ed were on their way to the local coffee shop, a small place where the owner, a kind-hearted woman named Linda, often gave out leftover pastries to those in need. As they approached, Ed noticed a black SUV parked outside, the engine idling. A man was sitting inside, staring straight ahead. It was Marcus. Ellie, sensing the tension in the air, kept walking, trying to ignore the man's watchful eyes. But Ed couldn't help himself. He slowed his pace, his instincts on edge. "Ellie," he began, his voice low. "I think something's wrong. I can't shake it." Ellie turned to him, her expression soft but firm. "Don't worry about him. Just keep your head down and focus on the food. That's all we need right now." But as they entered the shop, Ed's eyes remained fixed on the SUV. It wasn't just Marcus he was worried about. Something told him this wasn't just a random encounter. This was orchestrated. Have you ever had a gut feeling that something wasn't right? What did you do about it? Share your thoughts. The next few days passed in a haze for Ed, each one blurring into the next. The uncertainty he felt only grew, gnawing at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, Marcus's presence lingered in the back of his mind, a shadow following him wherever he went. Ellie, however, remained as unshaken as ever. She had a routine, one that she followed with quiet determination. Every morning, she'd head to the local coffee shop for scraps, and every evening, she'd return to the alley where they'd set up camp. She spoke of survival with a matter-of-fact tone, a tone that suggested she had long ago accepted the harsh realities of her existence. But Ed wasn't so sure. The strange feeling that had settled in his chest refused to let go. He couldn't shake the suspicion that Marcus was watching him, and that something big, was about to happen. It wasn't until the night the storm hit that everything changed. The wind howled down the streets, carrying with it the promise of a downpour. Ellie had already prepared for the worst, pulling her cart and blankets closer to the alley wall to shield herself from the elements. Ed had been pacing back and forth, eyes darting around the shadows, when he saw it. A car, black, sleek, and unmistakably out of place in the alley. The headlights swept across the scene, illuminating the piles of discarded trash and the flickering street lamp overhead. Ellie was already pulling her hood over her head, seemingly unfazed by the arrival. But Ed's instincts kicked into overdrive. His heart raced as he recognized the SUV from earlier. It was Marcus's car. Without thinking, Ed motioned to Ellie. "Get inside. Now." Ellie looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" "I don't know, but we need to move." Before she could respond, the car door opened. Marcus stepped out, his long coat billowing behind him, his sharp eyes scanning the alley. He looked different tonight, more confident, more purposeful. "Ellie, who is that?" Ed asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you, it's Marcus," Ellie said, though her tone was less certain now, a flicker of doubt creeping into her voice. Marcus's gaze shifted toward them. His eyes locked onto Ed, and for a split second, everything froze. The air felt thick with tension, and Ed could swear he could feel the man's eyes probing him, reading him like a book. "Ed," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an unsettling edge. "I've been looking for you." Ed's heart dropped into his stomach. He wanted to run. He wanted to get out of there, out of this nightmare, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He glanced at Ellie, who looked as confused as he felt. "Looking for me?" Ed repeated, his voice hoarse. "Why?" Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile you give when you know you hold all the cards. "Let's just say you and I have some unfinished business." Ellie stepped forward, positioning herself between Ed and Marcus. "You're scaring him. Just leave us alone." But Marcus didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "Ellie, you don't know who he is, do you?" Ellie's eyes narrowed. "Who he is? He's just Ed, a guy I met a few days ago. What's your deal, Marcus?" Marcus's smile grew. "Oh, Ellie, if only you knew. This man," he gestured to Ed, "he's not just some random stranger. He's someone who can change everything." Ed's head spun. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to the world he knew. What was this man talking about? Who did he think Ed was? Before Ed could respond, Marcus turned toward the car, signaling for someone inside to get out. Another figure stepped from the shadows, a woman this time. She was tall, with sharp features and a professional aura that screamed wealth and power. Ed's heart skipped a beat. The woman looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place her. She was dressed in a suit, her heels clicking on the pavement as she approached, her eyes locked on Ed with a mixture of curiosity and something more. "Ed," she said, her voice smooth and calculated, "I think it's time we talked." Ellie stepped back, her confusion deepening. "What the hell is going on here?" "Ellie, listen to me," Ed said, his voice strained. "I don't know these people. I've never seen them before in my life." But Marcus's smile didn't falter. "Not true, Ed. You've seen us, and we've seen you." The woman stepped closer, now only a few feet away from Ed. "We've been tracking you for a while. You've been living under the radar, but it's time we make you an offer you can't refuse. Have you ever had a moment when everything seemed to change in an instant? What would you do if you were Ed? Run, fight, or listen to what they have to say? Share your thoughts." The tension in the air thickened, each breath feeling like it might be the last. Ed's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing to process the words he had just heard. Track him? Follow him? He didn't understand. What did they want with him? Ellie stood frozen next to him, her face pale and tense. She had already seen too much in her life to be shocked easily, but this was different. Marcus wasn't just some random figure from the street. Neither was the woman beside him. "Who are you people?" Ed demanded, trying to steady his breath, trying to assert some control over the chaotic storm of emotions rising inside him. Marcus smiled, but it was a cold smile, one that sent a chill crawling down Ed's spine. "You don't remember, do you?" Ed's stomach twisted. "Remember what?" The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "You're not just some nobody, Ed. You were supposed to be part of something much bigger." She spoke the words like they were heavy, like they carried a weight that Ed couldn't even begin to comprehend. "What the hell are you talking about?" he muttered, taking a step back. Ellie's voice broke the silence, low and urgent. "Ed, what's going on? Do you know them?" Ed shook his head, feeling a growing sense of fear, but also confusion. Nothing about these people, or this situation, made sense. He wasn't anyone special, just some guy trying to survive. That's all he'd ever been. But the woman wasn't done. "You were part of a program, Ed. A project designed to help people like you, people who fell through the cracks, who had something more inside of them." "A program?" Ed repeated, his voice hoarse, his mind trying to catch up. "What do you mean, help people like me?" "I've never been part of any program." The woman's gaze was unwavering. "Yes, you were, but not by choice. You were taken in, tested, altered." She paused, her eyes glinting with something dark. "You were part of a government initiative, and when things went wrong, they erased your memory. They wiped you clean, and you were left to disappear, a casualty of a failed experiment." Ellie's breath caught, her face filled with disbelief as she looked at Ed. "Ed, is that true?" Ed's mind reeled. An experiment? He had no memory of anything like that. No recollection of any tests, no recollection of being taken. His life had always been a blur of struggles, losing his job, his family, everything that mattered. How could this woman claim that he'd been part of something that felt so alien to him? I don't remember any of that, Ed said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus took a step forward, his demeanor softening ever so slightly. That's the way they wanted it. They needed you to be blank. The project was too dangerous for anyone to remember. But you, he paused, his eyes narrowing. You were part of something much bigger than this. Something that could change the world. Ellie looked from Marcus to Ed, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. She had always known there was something about Ed that didn't fit. His instincts, his reaction times, the way he could navigate difficult situations. She had assumed it was just experience. But now, she wondered if there was more to him than she'd ever imagined. Ed, she said quietly, what if he's telling the truth? What if you were? What if you're part of something that could change everything? Ed's hands shook as he ran them through his hair, struggling to keep his composure. I don't know, Ellie. I don't remember any of it. I don't know who I am anymore. The woman, sensing his distress, softened her tone. I understand it's overwhelming, but you need to trust us. We've been trying to find you for years. We need you back, Ed. The world needs you back. Ed stepped back, shaking his head. No, I can't. I can't just go back to that. I'm not some science experiment. I'm just trying to live my life. Marcus's voice hardened. You don't have a choice in this, Ed. You were never meant to be forgotten. You were chosen for a reason. We're going to need you to help us complete the work that was started. Ellie's eyes darted between them, her expression conflicted. She had seen Ed's vulnerability, his human side. But now, it seemed like he was being forced into something bigger than any of them could understand. Don't do this, Ed, she whispered, her voice trembling. Don't go with them. I've seen what this city does to people like you. Don't let them control you. Ed met her gaze, his heart torn. He wanted to stay with her, to keep running, to keep fighting. But the words they spoke, the truth they seemed to hold, dug into him like a splinter in his mind. He was more than just a homeless man. He was a tool, a weapon in some forgotten war. But was that really him? Was he really that person? Ed, the woman said again, her voice now an entreaty. Please remember, you're not just a survivor. You're part of something much bigger than any of us. The world is waiting for you. For the first time, Ed felt a pull deep inside him, a sense that his past wasn't just a collection of empty days. But as the storm raged on outside, Ed knew one thing for certain. This was the moment where everything would change. What would you do if you discovered you had a past you couldn't remember? Would you accept it, or would you fight against it? Share your thoughts with us. The wind howled outside, the storm still raging with fury, but inside the dimly lit alley, there was a quiet intensity that hung in the air. The world outside seemed distant, muffled by the weight of the conversation unfolding between Ed, Ellie, and the mysterious strangers. Ed stood there, caught between two realities. One where he was just an ordinary man, struggling to survive in a harsh world, and another where he was someone important, someone with a purpose far greater than he could have ever imagined. Ellie, still beside him, was staring at him, her eyes filled with worry and uncertainty. She had never seen him like this. For the first time since they had met, Ed looked vulnerable, lost in a way that unsettled her. She had always known that Ed was different, but this was something else. Ed, she said softly, her voice filled with concern, you don't have to do this. Whatever they're saying, it doesn't have to define you. You've made it this far on your own. You don't need them. But Ed's eyes were distant, his mind far from the alley, far from her. He was thinking of the life he had lost, the life that had brought him here. What if there was more to it? What if he was more than just a man on the streets? Ellie, he finally whispered, his voice shaking slightly, I don't know what to believe anymore. The woman, who had been silent for a few moments, stepped forward again, her expression softened now, almost pleading. I understand this is hard for you, but you need to understand, you're not alone in this. You never were. Ed looked at her, his expression conflicted. Who are you, really? He asked, trying to grasp the truth of it all. Why me? Why did you pick me? We didn't pick you, Ed, the woman replied, her voice steady but tinged with a sense of regret. You were part of something bigger before you even knew it, and we didn't choose to erase your memories. It was done to protect you, to protect everyone else. But now, she sighed deeply, glancing at Marcus before returning her gaze to Ed. Now we need you back. The project is still active. The world needs the work you started, Ed. You're the key to it all. Marcus took a step forward, his tone turning serious. You were never meant to be a failure, Ed. You were meant to lead. We all made mistakes in the past, but this time, we want to correct it. We want you to finish what was started. Ed's mind swirled with confusion. How could he possibly be the key to something so enormous? He was just a man who had lost everything. How could he be the one to save anything? Look, Ed said, rubbing his forehead. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I even want to. I've spent so long just surviving. I don't even remember what it was like to have a purpose. Ellie took his hand, her voice soft but firm. You've always had a purpose, Ed. You just have to remember it. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the rain pouring harder against the pavement, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Marcus and the woman exchanged a look, but neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Ed turned to face them. The emotions inside him were raw, an overwhelming mix of fear, anger, and something else. Something deep and buried within him that was just beginning to stir. He could feel it now, a whisper at the edges of his consciousness, a sense that this was his chance to make a choice. I don't know who I was, Ed said quietly, his voice hoarse, but I know who I am now. I'm not going back to some lab or project. I'm not going to be part of something I don't understand. The woman's face fell, disappointment flashing in her eyes. You're making a mistake, Ed. But Ed wasn't done. I've made a lot of mistakes, yeah, but I'm not making this one. I'm not going to let you drag me back into something I can't control. I've fought too hard to just be a puppet for someone else. Ellie squeezed his hand tighter, offering a quiet but powerful support. For the first time, Marcus looked almost sympathetic. You have no idea what you're turning your back on. You think you're just one man, but you're not. You've already changed the world in ways you can't even begin to understand. We gave you everything, Ed. All the power, all the potential. And I'm giving it back, Ed cut in. I'm not doing this. I don't need to be anyone else. I'm enough as I am. There was a long pause, the tension in the air palpable. The woman stared at him, her eyes filled with something between regret and resolve. Very well, she said at last, her voice resigned. You've made your choice. But don't think this is over. We'll be watching you, Ed. You may not remember who you were, but we do. And one day, you'll have to face the truth. With that, she turned, signaling Marcus to follow. The two of them walked back to the black SUV, and without another word, they drove off, disappearing into the storm. Ed and Ellie stood there in silence for a few moments, the weight of what had just transpired settling over them like a heavy blanket. The rain was still pouring, but it no longer felt like a threat. Do you think they'll come back? Ellie asked quietly, still holding onto his hand. Ed shook his head. I don't know, but I do know one thing. I've made my choice, and I'm going to live with it. Ellie nodded, her face softening. You don't have to do it alone, you know. Whatever happens, I've got your back. Ed smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes for the first time in a long while. Thanks, Ellie. I think I'll need it. Have you ever had to make a tough decision that changed your life? What would you have done if you were Ed in this moment? Share your thoughts. The streets of the city felt quieter now, even though the rain still fell in heavy sheets, flooding the gutters and washing away the tension that had held Ed and Ellie captive just moments before. The storm outside mirrored the one that raged inside Ed's mind. Confusion, fear, and the strange, unsettling feeling of knowing that his life was no longer just his own. But as he stood there with Ellie, with her hand in his, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. He wasn't alone anymore. Ellie had always been by his side, even when he didn't want her to be. She had seen him at his worst, and yet she chose to stay. For the first time in years, Ed felt a strange peace settle over him. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't even have control over his past or his future. But he had this, He had this moment, this choice, and that was something he could own. "We should get out of here," Ellie said quietly, pulling him from his thoughts. Her voice was warm, but there was an edge of worry beneath it. "Who knows what they'll do next?" Ed nodded, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze before pulling his jacket tighter around him. They both knew the storm wasn't over, and it wasn't just the weather. The woman, Marcus, and the mysterious project, they were still out there. And sooner or later, they'd be back. But for now, they had this small victory. "Where do we go now?" Ed asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The streets were still unfamiliar to him in many ways, and the thought of running, of hiding, seemed exhausting. "I don't even know where to start." Ellie smiled, her eyes lighting up with a spark of hope. "One step at a time," she said. "We take it one step at a time, and we'll figure it out together." Ed chuckled, the sound of it almost foreign to him after so many years of silence. "One step at a time, huh? Sounds simple enough." "Simple doesn't mean easy," Ellie replied with a wink. "But it's all we've got, and it's a start." As they walked through the darkened streets, the city's neon lights flickering in the distance, Ed realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a future. He didn't know what that future would look like, but with Ellie beside him, he knew it would be different. They weren't running from their past anymore. They were walking towards something new, something that wasn't defined by who they had been, but by who they were choosing to become. What would you do if you were in Ed's shoes? Would you embrace the unknown or fight to keep your past from defining you? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts matter. And as the storm raged on, the city was left to wonder what would happen next. Would Ed and Ellie stay hidden, or would they rise to confront the truth of Ed's past? The story was far from over, but the path ahead was theirs to walk together. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The streets were quieter now, the rain slowing to a steady drizzle as Ed and Ellie walked through the familiar, yet strangely alien landscape of the city. They passed by stores that they had both seen 100 times, yet tonight they felt different. The world outside seemed unchanged, but Ed could no longer look at it the same way. The man he had been, the life he had lived, it was all shifting beneath him like the ground had begun to crack open. "I've been thinking," Ellie said after a long silence, her voice breaking through Ed's thoughts. "About what the woman said. About the project." Ed sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what they'd learned. It wasn't easy, facing the truth about what had happened to him, or what was still happening. "Yeah." Ellie looked at him, her expression serious. "I know you're not going back to them, but we can't pretend this isn't still affecting us. We can't outrun it forever." "I know," Ed said, rubbing his face. The tension in his chest seemed to grow with each passing moment. "But I don't even know where to start. I don't know what they want from me or why I'm so important." Ellie stopped walking and turned to face him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Ed, I've been with you long enough to know that you don't need to have all the answers. I don't need to know why they're after you or what you were before. All I know is that you've survived. And no matter how much you think you've lost, you're still here." Ed met her gaze, seeing the warmth and unwavering faith in her eyes. "But I can't keep living in the shadows, Ellie. I need to know who I really am, and I need to stop running from whatever this is." Ellie smiled softly. "You will, but you don't have to do it alone. You have me, and we'll figure this out together. One step at a time." The words resonated deeply within Ed. She was right. As much as the weight of the unknown pressed on him, he couldn't hide anymore. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, his identity. The decision was made. Ed couldn't keep wandering through the unknown, not when the truth was out there waiting to be uncovered. But there was a new question now, one that had been sitting in the back of his mind ever since the woman and Marcus had disappeared into the storm. What had they meant when they said he was the key? Was there more to his past than he had been told? Was there something about his life, his purpose, that could change everything? As much as he feared the answers, Ed couldn't ignore the pull. His past, his future, they were tied together, whether he wanted them to be or not. And there was only one way to find out what this project was really about. He had to confront it. Days passed in a blur as Ed and Ellie worked to piece together the fragments of Ed's past. They visited the places he vaguely remembered, talking to people he might have known, piecing together the hints of a life that felt distant but also somehow familiar. The more they uncovered, the more Ed realized how much he had left behind. But he also realized that he was no longer the same person who had walked into that alley with nothing but fear and uncertainty. The man who had walked away from that life was different, stronger, more determined. He wasn't just going to find the answers. He was going to own them. It wasn't just about figuring out who he was anymore. It was about standing up for the life he had now. If you were in Ed's shoes, would you try to uncover your past, or would you focus on building a future free from it? What would you prioritize, answers or moving forward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city, but Ed barely noticed. His focus was elsewhere, on the folder he had just uncovered at a small, obscure library. It was a thin, unassuming file, wedged between stacks of forgotten books and dusty papers. But as soon as Ed laid his hands on it, a sense of recognition washed over him. He didn't know why, but somehow, this file felt important, like it held the missing piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he had started to put together. Ellie stood beside him, her eyes watching him carefully, her presence grounding him. She hadn't said much in the past few hours as they sifted through old records, trying to uncover any trace of Ed's life before the streets. She knew that this was hard for him, but she was here, and that was what mattered. "Do you think this is it?" Ellie asked softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was filled with a quiet hope, a hope that Ed had long since stopped allowing himself to feel. Ed didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the file with trembling hands. Inside, there were pages of research notes, photographs, and typed documents with scientific jargon that made his head spin. But it was the name at the top of the first page that caught his attention. "Drive E. Hawthorne," Ed murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie leaned in closer, her brow furrowing. "Who's that?" Ed's throat tightened. He didn't know, but something about the name felt like it belonged to him. Drive E. Hawthorne. Could this be the person who had been part of the mysterious project? The one who had erased his memories? Without saying anything, Ed flipped through the pages, scanning the notes. The words started to blur together, but then, one particular sentence caught his eye. It was a brief note, handwritten in the margins of a page, almost as an afterthought. "Subject is vital to the success of Phase 2. Removal of memories was necessary to ensure compliance. Further manipulation will be required." Ed's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Memories had been erased, and he was a subject? He had been part of something that was supposed to be controlled? The shock hit him like a punch to the gut, but it was the last sentence that made his skin crawl. Further manipulation will be required. The words felt like a threat, a promise that whatever had been done to him wasn't over. Ellie was watching him closely, her hand on his arm. "Ed, what is it? What did you find?" Ed's hand shook as he passed her the file. She read through it quickly, her face growing more and more serious with each line. When she was finished, she looked up at him, her eyes wide. This is something big, Ed. And it's not just about you. It's about something much larger than us. We need to find out who Dr. Hawthorne is, and what Phase 2 is." Ed nodded, his mind racing. He had known this wasn't just about his past. But now, the stakes were higher. Whoever was behind this project had planned for him to be more than just a survivor. They wanted him to be part of something he had no memory of, and the idea of being controlled like that, it sent a shiver down his spine. "We'll find out," Ed said, his voice steadying with determination. "We have to." That night, as they sat in their small apartment, the weight of what they had uncovered hung over them. Ellie was making a pot of coffee, her usual calm demeanor hiding the worry that lingered beneath the surface. She knew how much Ed had suffered, how much he had lost. But now, it felt like everything they had been fighting for was tied to something far darker and more complicated than they could have imagined. "Do you think anyone else knows about this?" Ellie asked, her voice breaking the silence. "I don't know," Ed replied, his mind still spinning from the revelations. "But whoever Dr. Hawthorne is, they have to know what's going on. This project, it's not just something that happened to me. It's part of something much bigger." Ellie nodded. "Then we need to find them." and we need to stop them before they can do anything more. Ed's eyes hardened with resolve. We will. They didn't know what the next steps would be or where this road would take them. But one thing was certain. They couldn't go back. Whatever had been done to Ed, whatever secrets the past held, they were going to uncover them. And they would fight together to ensure that whatever Phase 2 was, it would never be realized. What would you do if you discovered you were part of a secret project, with your memories erased and manipulated? Would you fight to uncover the truth, or would you try to leave the past behind? Share your thoughts with us. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty and fear. Ed and Ellie didn't sleep much. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the haunting words in the file. Further manipulation will be required. The ominous note had become a constant echo in Ed's mind, a reminder that whoever was behind this project was still in control, still watching, and that meant their lives were at risk. But there was no turning back now. Ed and Ellie had decided to dig deeper into Drive E. Hawthorne. The name now felt like a key that could unlock the door to his past, and they were determined to find it, no matter the cost. They began scouring online databases, searching through medical journals, and visiting libraries and archives. But there were no easy answers. Dr. Hawthorne seemed to exist in the fringes of scientific circles, with very little information publicly available. The few references they found were vague, mentions of cutting-edge research in neurobiology and memory manipulation, along with cryptic notes about a project that never went public. But it was the final entry that finally gave them a lead. It was a low-key medical journal, published in a small, obscure clinic in a city miles away from where Ed had been. The paper was about advanced memory erasure techniques. And in the acknowledgement section, there it was again, Drive E. Hawthorne, lead researcher. The paper didn't reveal much about the project itself, but it did mention a facility, the Colfax Institute. The Colfax Institute? Ellie repeated, her voice tight with concern. Where is that? I've never heard of it. Ed leaned in, scanning the page. It's not listed on any map, but if it's connected to Hawthorne's work, then it's where we need to go. Ellie sat back, her eyes narrowing with caution. Do you really think it's safe to go there? We don't even know what's waiting for us. I don't care anymore, Ed said, his voice firm, almost desperate. We've been running for too long. If they want me, if they think they can control me, then I'm going to take the fight to them. Ellie's expression softened. We'll do it together, Ed, but we need to be smart about this. We don't know what we're walking into. Ed nodded, though his mind was already racing with plans. They needed to find this Colfax Institute, and whatever it took, they needed to uncover what it had to do with him. He could feel the pieces of his past starting to fall into place, but the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Whoever Dr. Hawthorne was, whatever the project had been, it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future. The next day, Ed and Ellie set out on a journey to find the Colfax Institute. The path ahead wasn't clear, but they had one piece of solid information. The location of the institute was tied to an old, defunct industrial building on the outskirts of a small town. They rented a car and drove for hours, the city's lights fading behind them as they made their way into the unknown. As they neared the town, the atmosphere grew heavier. The landscape became more desolate, the roads less traveled. The only sign of life was the occasional farmhouse, the distant bark of a dog, and the oppressive silence of the world around them. When they finally reached the outskirts of the town, they saw the building in the distance. It stood tall and imposing, a fortress of glass and steel surrounded by barbed wire and security cameras. It didn't look like an institute. It looked like a prison. This is it, Ed said, his voice low, a mix of apprehension and determination. Ellie looked at him, her eyes scanning the building. We're sure this is the place? There's no doubt, Ed replied. This is where it all started. This is where they changed me. They parked a few blocks away, hidden in the shadows of the crumbling buildings that lined the street. They needed a plan. They couldn't just walk in there blindly. They had to be smart. We'll need to get inside, see what's really going on in there, Ellie said, her voice steady. We can't take any chances. We don't know who's still working there or what they're doing now. Ed nodded. We find a way in, figure out what we're dealing with, and then we expose it. We'll get the answers we need. But as they prepared to move closer to the Colfax Institute, neither of them could shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. They didn't know who was watching them, who might already know they were coming. And yet, despite the fear, Ed couldn't ignore the pull. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would finally confront the past and whatever dark secrets it held. And whatever happened next, he would not back down. What would you do if you were in Ed's position, walking into a place like Colfax Institute? Would you push forward and confront the truth? Or would you hesitate, unsure of what you might uncover? Share your thoughts with us. The night air was cold and damp as Ed and Ellie crouched low behind a rusted metal fence, just beyond the reach of the security cameras. The Colfax Institute loomed before them, an intimidating fortress of concrete and steel. From their vantage point, the building seemed deserted, but Ed knew better. Nothing in this world was ever truly empty, not when it came to secrets like these. "I'm not liking this," Ellie whispered, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "This place feels off." Ed glanced at her, his eyes narrowing in determination. "I know, but we don't have a choice. We're not leaving until we have answers." Ellie gave him a look, one that said she wasn't entirely convinced, but she didn't argue. She was as ready as he was to find out what lay behind the walls of this place. The security was tight. Barbed wire surrounded the perimeter, and the few guards they had seen patrolling the area seemed alert, methodical in their rounds. There was no easy way in, but Ed had spent enough time on the streets to know that nothing was impenetrable, not when you were desperate enough. "We need to get past the cameras," Ed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we can figure out where to go next." Ellie nodded and reached into her bag. She pulled out a small, black device, a signal jammer. "This should block the camera's feed for a few minutes. It's not a perfect solution, but it'll give us a window to get closer." Ed took the device from her and turned it on. A soft beep sounded, followed by a series of static noises. The faint red lights on the security cameras flickered before going dark. "All right, let's move," Ed muttered, his heart pounding. They slipped through the narrow gap in the fence, moving quickly and quietly, staying low to avoid detection. As they approached the building, the shadows seemed to swallow them up, hiding their movements from prying eyes. The institute loomed closer now, a towering structure of cold, glass windows and steel doors. There were no lights on inside, no sign of activity, just the eerie hum of machines and the distant sound of wind. Ed's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. They reached the main entrance, a set of heavy, reinforced doors. The lock was advanced, but not impenetrable. Ellie took the lead, pulling out a set of lockpicks she had kept from her days in the field. She worked quickly, her hands steady and practiced. "Got it," she whispered, pushing the door open just wide enough for them to slip inside. The interior of the building was dark and silent. The cold air smelled of old paper and chemicals. They could hear the faint hum of machinery from deeper within, but it was clear no one was immediately nearby. Ed motioned for Ellie to follow him as he crept down a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with doors, most of them closed, some ajar. He didn't know what he was looking for, but instinct told him that they had to go deeper into the building, past the surface-level rooms. They moved cautiously, checking each corner before advancing, their steps muffled by the thick carpeting that covered the floors. They passed a series of office doors, most of them locked or deserted, but nothing of importance, until they came to a large steel door at the end of the hallway. This one was different. It was locked, but there was a keypad next to the door, a series of numbers flashing on the screen. "I don't think we're supposed to go in there," Ellie said, her voice tense. "But I think that's where the answers are." Ed nodded, his resolve hardening. He had to know. Whatever was behind this door, whatever it took, they were getting in. "Can you hack it?" Ed asked. Ellie glanced at the keypad and then back at him. "I can try. But if this place is as high security as I think it is, we're going to need more than just a simple code." She pulled out a small portable device from her bag, her own tool for bypassing security. With a few quick taps on the screen, she began typing in commands, her eyes scanning the numbers on the keypad. Ed kept a lookout, his ears straining for any sounds of approaching footsteps. Minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Ellie let out a breath of relief. Got it. With a soft click, the door unlocked. Ellie pushed it open, and Ed stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike anything they had expected. It was large, filled with high-tech equipment, computers, monitors, and tanks filled with strange, unidentifiable substances. There were also large metal cabinets, each labeled with cryptic codes and symbols. The air was thick with the sterile smell of chemicals and the hum of machinery. Jesus, Ellie muttered, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. What is all this? Ed moved toward the nearest cabinet, opening it carefully. Inside, there were rows of vials, some filled with a glowing liquid, others empty. His heart raced as he realized that these were not just medical supplies. These were experiments. But it was the file on the desk at the far end of the room that drew his attention. It was thick, labeled with the same cryptic code that was on the cabinets. This is it, Ed said, voice steady, as he reached for the file. He opened it slowly, scanning the pages. The first few were filled with data, but then he saw the words he had been dreading. Subject 12, successful integration of Phase 2 protocol. Memory manipulation complete. Subject retained key neural pathways, though mental stability remains in question. Ed's heart skipped a beat. Subject 12. He was Subject 12. The truth hit him like a wave. Everything, the memories, the experiments, it was all real. And the worst part was, it was far from over. Ellie glanced at him, her face pale. Ed, we need to get out of here. Now. But Ed couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the weight of the truth. The file had more, and he needed to know everything. He wasn't going to leave until he had all the answers. How would you react if you discovered you were part of an experiment like Ed? Would you confront those responsible, or would you try to escape and leave the past behind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Ed couldn't tear his eyes away from the file. The words on the pages blurred together as his mind struggled to process the overwhelming truth. Subject 12. The realization was staggering. The project had been about him. His memories, his mind, his very identity. He ran his fingers over the pages, desperate to find more, to understand the full extent of what had been done to him. The more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about memory manipulation. It was a full-scale experiment in psychological control, altering not only memories but emotions, behavior, and even the very essence of a person's personality. How could they do this? Ellie whispered from behind him. She was standing near the door, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. This is monstrous. Ed didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, and every word on the page felt like a heavy blow. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. Who had done this to him? Why? And what had happened to the other subjects? The file detailed numerous experiments, each one more disturbing than the last. But there were also mentions of recovery phases and successful integration, suggesting that some subjects had been successfully altered, their memories reshaped, and their lives re-engineered. Phase 2 had been about implanting new memories, but what had been the endgame? What was the purpose behind this twisted research? Then he came across a name, Drive E. Hawthorne. It was the same name that had appeared in the file at the Colfax Institute, the name of the lead researcher. But it wasn't just his name that caught Ed's attention. It was the mention of a Project Titan, an ambitious, secretive initiative designed to push the boundaries of memory manipulation and psychological control. The document detailed several key milestones, but the most chilling part was a note at the end. Subject 12. Potential for further experimentation remains. Additional memory layers needed for full integration. Subject's psychological stability remains volatile. Ed felt his stomach twist. Further experimentation. It wasn't over. They still wanted something from him. This can't be happening, Ellie murmured, unable to look away from the file. This is like something out of a dystopian nightmare. I don't understand, Ed said, his voice tight with emotion. If I was part of this, why can't I remember it? Why are my memories so fragmented? Why don't I know who I am anymore? Ellie walked over, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Ed, what if they've been erasing your memories the whole time? What if your entire life has been manipulated? Your thoughts, your experiences, your very identity. Her words hit him like a freight train. He had never been able to remember the full scope of his past. his childhood, his family, the moments that should have shaped him. And now it seemed that it wasn't just lost to time. It had been intentionally erased, altered, and manipulated by the very people he thought he could trust. Who's behind this? Ed asked, the weight of the question heavy on his chest. Who's controlling all of this? Ellie glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the dark corners. It's not just Hawthorne, is it? There's something bigger here. This Project Titan, it's not just about you. It's about control, about power. Ed nodded slowly, understanding what she was implying. Project Titan wasn't just an experiment. It was part of something far greater. A plan to reshape people, to control them, to break them down and rebuild them into something else. But for what purpose? And why was he chosen? His mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Then, he noticed something else in the file, a set of coordinates. A location that was marked in bold red ink, as if it held some kind of significance. This is it, Ed said, his voice a whisper of determination. This is where we need to go next. The answers are there. Ellie raised an eyebrow. You think it's safe? We barely got in here without being caught. We don't have a choice, Ed replied, his voice hardening with resolve. If we want to end this, we need to follow this lead. We need to go to these coordinates and figure out what's really going on. Ellie hesitated but nodded. Okay, I'm with you. But we need to be careful. We don't know who's watching us. Ed didn't respond. He was already folding the file back up, shoving it into his jacket. His mind was already focused on the next step, the next move. The path ahead was unclear, but there was no turning back now. As they made their way back to the door, Ed couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Every creak of the building, every footstep in the distance seemed to echo louder than it should have. And when they reached the hallway, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was wrong. Without warning, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Get down, Ellie hissed, pulling him back into the shadows just as the door to the lab creaked open. A figure stepped into the hallway, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a mask. They stopped just feet away from where Ed and Ellie were hiding, their eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the figure spoke, their voice cold and mechanical. You shouldn't have come here. If you were Ed and Ellie, how would you handle being caught in a situation like this? What would be your next move? Would you confront the stranger? Or would you try to escape undetected? Share your thoughts with us. The air seemed to freeze as the masked figure stood in the hallway, its presence like a dark shadow stretching toward Ed and Ellie. Every muscle in Ed's body tensed. The world felt smaller in that moment, the walls closing in as if the building itself were conspiring against them. Ellie grabbed his arm, her grip tight but steady. We need to move now, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Ed didn't move. His eyes were locked on the figure. There was something unsettling about the way they stood there, unmoving, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for them. Then the voice came again, this time softer, more deliberate. You shouldn't have come here. You've seen too much already. Ed's heart raced. Too much? Had they been expecting them? Had the Colfax Institute known they would come here? Ellie pulled at his sleeve. Ed, we can't do this. We need to leave before. Before she could finish, the figure moved. With a swift, fluid motion, they advanced down the hallway toward them. Ed instinctively stepped forward, his feet heavy as if the weight of their situation had doubled in an instant. What do you want from us? Ed demanded, his voice more forceful than he intended. The masked figure stopped just a few feet away, their posture unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with tension. I don't want anything from you, the figure replied. I'm here to stop you. Ellie's hand tightened around the stun gun she had kept hidden in her jacket, but she didn't make a move. She knew better than to act impulsively. The stranger's words were laced with something ominous, and her instincts were screaming that they were in far deeper than they had realized. Ed took a step back, his eyes narrowing. Why? Who are you? The figure cocked their head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. Finally, they spoke again, their voice colder than before. I'm someone who understands what you've walked into, what you've uncovered. You're too late. Ellie glanced at Ed, her face tense with unease. "We're not leaving without answers," she said, her voice unwavering despite the danger that loomed. The stranger let out a soft, almost pitying sigh. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can undo what's been set in motion?" Ed's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of the stranger's words, their threat hanging over them like a cloud. Everything he had believed about his past, his memories, his identity, was crumbling before him. But it wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than his personal struggle. "We're not here to undo anything," Ed said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're here to stop it. Whatever it is that's happening, we're going to put a stop to it." The figure didn't respond at first. They simply stood there, the dim light casting strange shadows across their mask. Then, with a quick motion, they pulled something from their belt, a small device that emitted a high-pitched sound, too high for Ed to hear, but powerful enough to make the air around them vibrate. Ellie gasped. "What's that?" Before Ed could react, the figure pressed the device to their own ear, and then in a voice that had lost all humanity, they spoke. "The subject is aware. Initiate containment procedure." Ed's eyes widened. Containment procedure? He turned to Ellie, but before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway from behind them. A second figure appeared, this one also masked, moving toward them with purpose. Then another, and another. "Shit," Ellie hissed, pulling Ed back toward the lab door. "We're surrounded." The first figure made a move, stepping toward them with a fluidity that felt unnatural. "There's no way out," the voice said, their tone detached, robotic even. "You'll never make it." Ellie yanked Ed away, just as the second figure lunged forward, their hand reaching for him. A shot of adrenaline surged through Ed as he grabbed Ellie's wrist and pulled her in the opposite direction, toward the nearest exit. They bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing loudly as the sound of pursuit grew louder. The building, which had once seemed so quiet, now felt alive with danger, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. "Where do we go?" Ellie panted, glancing over her shoulder as they rounded a corner. "I don't know," Ed admitted, his heart racing, "but we can't stop." The hallway stretched on ahead, a maze of doors and corridors that seemed to wind in every direction. They couldn't afford to waste time choosing the wrong path. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Ellie asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Ed's mind was working in overdrive, searching for any way out of the nightmare they had found themselves in. He had always been resourceful, but this was different. The Institute wasn't just a place. It was a fortress. Suddenly, he stopped, an idea hitting him like a jolt of electricity. "There's a maintenance tunnel," he said, his eyes scanning the walls. "I remember reading about it in the file. It's an old access point. If we can find it, it'll lead us outside." Ellie didn't question him. They ran toward the nearest door, and Ed pushed it open with force. Inside, the room was cluttered with old equipment and tools, but in the far corner, a metal hatch was set into the floor, nearly hidden beneath a pile of discarded crates. Ed rushed to the hatch and pulled it open. It creaked in protest, but it gave way, revealing a narrow, dimly lit staircase that descended into darkness. "We don't have time to waste," Ed said, helping Ellie down first. "Get in." We go down, and we don't look back. But as they descended, Ed couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The eyes of the Institute were on them, always watching. And no matter how far they ran, there was no escaping the web they had walked into. If you were in Ed's shoes, how would you react to being chased by figures like this? Would you try to fight back, or would you focus on escaping? What's your strategy for survival in a situation like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The hatch slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them off from the chaos above. The darkness of the maintenance tunnel swallowed them whole, leaving only the faint glow of Ed's phone screen to light their way. Each step they took echoed in the narrow passage, amplifying the tension that clung to the air. Ellie was breathing heavily, her pulse racing in sync with the pounding of her feet on the cold concrete floor. "Do you think they'll follow us down here?" she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. Ed didn't answer right away. He was too focused on moving forward, each step taking them farther from the danger above. But the fear gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the thought that they were being led deeper into something far darker than they could have imagined. "We have to keep moving," Ed said, his voice low and strained. "We can't afford to stop." The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, winding and twisting through the bowels of the building. The faint hum of machinery buzzed in the distance, the only sound besides their footsteps. The air was damp, the walls slick with moisture. It felt like they were walking through the bowels of a forgotten world, one that had been abandoned, hidden, and deliberately forgotten. Ellie stumbled behind him. "Ed, where are we even going?" "I don't know," Ed admitted, glancing back at her. "But we need to find a way out. This is the only chance we have." They continued on in silence, the weight of their situation settling in. The further they went, the more oppressive the darkness felt. It wasn't just the physical darkness, but the mental weight of everything they had uncovered. The manipulation, the lies, the experiments. Each step seemed to draw them closer to the heart of the storm. Then, ahead of them, a light flickered. It was dim, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Ed's heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" Ellie nodded, her expression hardening. "I saw it. Let's go." They quickened their pace, moving cautiously toward the light. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, its walls lined with old pipes and wires that hummed with life. In the center of the room was a single, steel door. It was different from the others they had passed, newer, more secure-looking, and it was the source of the flickering light. Ed felt a sense of urgency rising in him. They had to get through that door. But as they approached it, he felt a strange pull, something tugging at him, a memory just beyond his reach. He couldn't place it, but something about that door felt wrong. "Stay close," Ed whispered to Ellie, his voice tight. They reached the door, and Ed tried the handle. It was locked. Of course, it was locked. Everything seemed to be designed to keep them trapped. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. His eyes scanned the room for something, anything, that could help them. "Here," Ellie said suddenly, pointing to a small access panel next to the door. "It's a security override. If I can hack into it, we can get through." Ed didn't hesitate. "Do it. Now." Ellie moved swiftly, pulling a small device from her bag and attaching it to the panel. Her fingers flew over the screen, her expression focused as the device worked to bypass the security. Ed kept watch, his senses heightened. Seconds felt like hours. The door seemed to loom larger the longer they waited. "Got it," Ellie exclaimed, her voice filled with a rush of relief. The door clicked open, and Ed didn't waste a second. He shoved it open, stepping into the room beyond. The light inside was blinding at first, and Ed squinted against it. But what he saw next made his blood run cold. It wasn't a simple storage room or a maintenance area. It was a control center. Monitors lined the walls, each one displaying various images, surveillance footage, diagrams, files. There were more figures, masked and silent, moving around the room, their faces obscured. They didn't notice Ed and Ellie at first. Ed's heart pounded as he stepped further into the room. He recognized some of the images on the screens. There were familiar faces, faces he had seen in his own fragmented memories. Faces of people he had never consciously met but now felt strangely connected to. "Who are these people?" Ellie muttered, stepping up beside him. "I don't know," Ed said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I think they're part of the project. Project Titan." As he spoke, the sound of a door opening behind them cut through the tension. Two masked figures entered the room, their eyes immediately locking onto Ed and Ellie. "There they are," one of the figures said, their voice muffled by the mask but unmistakably cold. "We've been expecting you." Ellie stepped in front of Ed, holding up the stun gun. "Stay back," she warned, her voice sharp. But the figures didn't flinch. Instead, one of them moved toward a nearby console and pressed a button. The door they had just entered through slid shut, locking with a heavy clank. Ed's pulse raced. "What is this? Why are you doing this?" The masked figure didn't respond at first. They just stared at him, their eyes hidden behind the black mask. Finally, they spoke in a voice that sent a chill down Ed's spine. "You don't understand. You never will." The words were like a death sentence. Ed's mind reeled. He wasn't just part of some experiment. He was a tool, a pawn in a much larger, far more dangerous game. And now, they were trapped. "We need to get out of here," Ellie whispered urgently, pulling at Ed's sleeve. But Ed was rooted to the spot. His mind was racing. There had to be something. There had to be a way out. And then, a voice crackled through the room's intercom system, sending a wave of dread through him. "Subject 12 has escaped. Begin the protocol." What do you think protocol means in this context? Do you believe Ed and Ellie can escape this new threat? Or are they walking into a trap from which they can't get out? Share your theories with us in the comments. The voice from the intercom echoed in the control room, its words sending an icy chill down Ed's spine. "Subject 12 has escaped. Begin the protocol." The command was cold, precise, like a death sentence being read aloud. Ellie's grip on the stun gun tightened as she turned toward Ed, her eyes wide with panic. "Ed, we need to get out of here now." But Ed didn't move. His mind raced, trying to process everything he had just heard. Subject 12. The words hit him like a ton of bricks. He was Subject 12. And whatever this protocol was, it didn't sound good. The two masked figures in the control room didn't speak. They simply stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they had all the time in the world. Ed's heart hammered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. But there was nowhere to go. The door had locked behind them, and the other exit was now blocked by the figures. His mind spun, desperately searching for an escape route, but nothing came to mind. "We've been waiting for you," the voice from the intercom said again, as if it were taunting him. Ellie glanced around frantically, then turned back to Ed. "We need to find the controls, shut them down. It's the only way to stop this." "Right?" Ed said, his voice trembling, but determined. "Let's go." The control room was filled with rows of computers and monitors, and Ed quickly scanned the layout, hoping to find something, anything, that could help them. His eyes landed on a large panel near the back wall, one that seemed to be the central hub for the entire operation. "That's it," he said, pointing to the panel. "If we can get to that, maybe we can stop the protocol before it's too late." Ellie didn't hesitate. She ran toward the panel, her eyes flicking over the complex array of buttons and switches. "It's locked," she muttered, pressing her fingers against the screen in frustration. "Let me try," Ed said, stepping forward. He had seen similar panels in his time at the Institute, and though it felt like a lifetime ago, he had some knowledge of how they worked. His fingers danced across the screen, swiping through the system's security layers. The tension in the room grew with each passing second. "You have to hurry," Ellie urged, her voice tight with fear. Ed's eyes burned with focus. He had one shot at this. If he didn't get it right, they were done for. He could feel the pressure mounting, the seconds ticking by like hours. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the panel beeped and the red warning lights turned off, replaced by a steady green glow. "Got it," Ed breathed, relief flooding through him for a brief moment. But the next words out of Ellie's mouth made his blood run cold. "Ed, behind you." He turned just in time to see the masked figures advancing on them. Their movements were smooth, almost inhuman. One of them reached out with a gloved hand, pulling a syringe from their belt. "You shouldn't have interfered," the voice said, its tone almost mechanical. Ellie reacted instantly, stepping in front of Ed and raising the stun gun. She fired, sending a burst of electricity toward the figure closest to them. The figure jerked back, its body spasming for a split second before it regained its composure. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it lunged at Ellie. "Ellie!" Ed shouted, rushing forward to grab her, pulling her out of the way just as the figure's hand reached for her. But it was too late. The other masked figure had already closed the distance between them, and before Ed could react, they slammed him into the wall with brutal force. The air rushed out of his lungs as his back hit the concrete, the world spinning around him. Ellie screamed, but the sound was muffled as she struggled to break free from the grasp of the first figure. "You can't stop it," the second figure said, their voice cold and devoid of emotion. "It's already begun. You're too late." Ed's mind was reeling, his vision blurring as he struggled to regain his footing. Too late? Was this it? Were they already trapped in whatever dark protocol had been set in motion? Desperation surged through him. No, they couldn't give up now. With a grunt, Ed shoved the figure off of him, staggering to his feet. His body was battered, but the fire in his chest burned brighter than ever. He couldn't let this end like this. Ellie, we need to get out now, Ed shouted, his voice hoarse. Ellie, still struggling against the first figure, looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of panic and determination. She freed one of her arms and pointed toward a door on the far side of the room. Through there, she yelled. Without another word, Ed dashed toward the door, hoping against hope that it would lead them to safety. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him, growing closer, and for a moment, he thought they might be too late. But then, just as he reached the door, the panel above it lit up with a blinding red light. A loud siren blared, filling the room with its deafening wail. The protocol was already in motion. As the door slammed open, Ed didn't hesitate. He pulled Ellie through it, and they ran into the unknown, not knowing what awaited them on the other side, but knowing they couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Do you think Ed and Ellie can make it out of this alive? What do you think the protocol will do to them? How would you handle the situation if you were in their shoes? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments. Ed and Ellie sprinted down the narrow hallway, their feet pounding against the cold concrete floor, the siren's wail growing louder in their ears. The sound felt like it was closing in on them, suffocating, as if it were a warning, telling them they had run too far, too fast. The red lights that flashed above them seemed to mock their every step, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. There was no turning back now. Every twist and turn felt like it was taking them deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, and the sense of dread that clung to the air grew heavier with each passing second. Where the hell are we? Ellie gasped, her voice strained. She was out of breath, but there was no time to rest. The figures, those masked operatives, were still on their tail, and Ed could hear them closing in. I don't know, Ed replied, his mind racing, but wherever it is, it's not good. I think we're in the heart of whatever this place is, whatever they've been hiding from us. They came to another junction in the hallway, and Ed hesitated for a moment, looking both ways. He had no idea which way to go. Every hallway seemed to lead to more dead ends, more locked doors, more cages. The panic was starting to set in. I don't think we can outrun them, Ed, Ellie said, her voice breaking the silence. We need to figure out a way to stop this before they catch us. Ed nodded, his mind spinning. He was trying to think of a way to stop the protocol, but everything was happening too fast. They were too far in, and he couldn't help but wonder, what if this was all part of the plan? What if they had been playing right into their hands the entire time? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, coming from behind them. They're getting closer, Ellie whispered urgently. I know, Ed replied, his heart racing, but then he stopped dead in his tracks. The hallway ahead was blocked by a large metal door, one that looked far sturdier than any of the others they had encountered. This was different. This was the final barrier, the one that led into the heart of whatever they were up against. Help me with this door, Ed said, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Ellie rushed to his side, and together, they tried to pry open the door. But it wouldn't budge. Ed slammed his fist against it in frustration, the metal ringing like a bell. There's no way through it, Ed, Ellie said, her eyes wide with fear. But Ed wasn't listening. He was staring at something beside the door, an access panel. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. Wait, Ed said, his voice laced with hope. I think I can override it. This is it. This is the final piece. He stepped forward, his hands shaking as he worked to open the panel. Sweat dripped down his face, but he couldn't stop now. He had to do this, for both of them. The thought of the protocol, of what might happen if they failed, spurred him on. Ellie stood watch, her eyes darting to the hallway behind them. Ed, hurry. They're almost here. Ed's fingers flew over the controls, his mind focused on the task at hand. It was just a few more seconds, a few more, before the door would open. Then, they would finally have the answers they were searching for. And then, with a soft click, the panel lit up, and the door began to hum as it slowly opened. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. You did it. But as the door slid open, they were met with a sight that left them frozen in place. The room beyond was vast, stretching farther than Ed could see, filled with rows upon rows of computer terminals, servers, and strange machines that hummed with a life of their own. It looked like a high-tech command center, but there was something eerie about it, something unnatural. This is it, Ed whispered, stepping inside. This is where it all started. He felt a sudden wave of recognition wash over him, and his heart skipped a beat. The machines, the monitors, he had seen them before. Somewhere. But where? As they ventured deeper into the room, Ed noticed something that made his blood run cold. On one of the monitors, a live feed was playing, a feed of himself and Ellie, standing in the hallway just moments ago. The feed was live. They were being watched. No, Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. This is where it all comes together, isn't it? They've been tracking us the entire time. Ed didn't answer. His mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fall into place. Everything, the experiments, the surveillance, the strange sense of déjà vu, was connected. It was all part of a much larger operation, one that went far beyond anything they had ever imagined. This is worse than I thought, Ed murmured. We're not just pawns. We're projects. Ellie shook her head, refusing to accept it. No, we're not their experiments. We're not their lab rats. But Ed wasn't so sure anymore. He was starting to realize that the world they thought they knew had been carefully constructed, manipulated to serve a hidden agenda. Their lives, their very existence, had been shaped by forces they had never even seen coming. Just then, the intercom crackled to life once more, and the cold, robotic voice echoed through the room. Initiating final protocol. Subject 12 and companion will be processed accordingly. All obstacles will be removed. Ed's stomach dropped. The final protocol was happening, and there was no turning back. What do you think the final protocol will entail? Do you think Ed and Ellie are truly just pawns in a larger scheme? Or is there a way they can fight back? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments. The room seemed to close in on Ed and Ellie as the intercom's chilling message echoed in their ears. The final protocol was in motion, and every second felt like it could be their last. Ellie's breath hitched as she glanced around the high-tech command center. It was like something out of a dystopian nightmare, a place where human lives were mere data points, easily manipulated, cataloged, and discarded. Her hands trembled at her sides. Ed, what do we do now? Ed's mind raced, his thoughts swirling like a storm. Final protocol. He kept repeating the phrase in his mind, trying to piece together what it could mean. There were too many questions. Who had been orchestrating all of this, why they had been targeted, and most importantly, what the final protocol would do to them. This is bigger than we thought, Ed muttered, more to himself than to Ellie. He glanced over at the monitors, which were now displaying several files labeled with his name. Subject 12. There were images, documents, videos. His entire life was laid bare in front of him. Wait. Ellie's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Look at this. She pointed to a terminal on the far side of the room, where a series of cryptic files had just appeared. They were labeled with numbers, and some had a red warning icon flashing beside them. Ed moved quickly to the terminal, his fingers shaking as he accessed the files. The information was there, too much of it. Everything about his childhood, his past, his time at the Institute, even his escape, all meticulously documented. The deeper he scrolled, the more his stomach churned. It's all been planned, Ed whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and fury. I'm not just a subject in an experiment. I've been a target from the start. This whole thing, it's been orchestrated. Ellie stepped closer, her eyes scanning the documents with increasing horror. This isn't just some isolated incident, is it? This is global. It's like they've been tracking every move we've made, every step we've taken. Ed's mind snapped back to the voices he had heard earlier. The protocol. It was more than just a surveillance system. It was the mechanism for eliminating anything, or anyone, that stood in their way. We're not the only ones, Ed said slowly, his voice grim. There are others like me. Others who've been part of this experiment. Before Ellie could respond, a low hum filled the room, followed by a metallic click. Ed whipped around just in time to see a door at the back of the command center open, revealing two more of the masked figures. They stepped into the room with cold, calculated precision, their eyes hidden behind the featureless masks. Subject 12. The voice from the intercom was calm now, almost pleased. It's time to finish the protocol. There is no escape. Ed's heart pounded in his chest as the masked figures approached. He had no doubt that they weren't here for a conversation. They were here to eliminate them. Ellie, move, Ed shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the exit they had just come through. But as they turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The entire room was now sealed off. This is it, isn't it? Ellie breathed, her voice filled with a quiet resignation. No, Ed snapped, pushing aside the rising panic. We're not going down like this. There has to be another way out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help. The room was a maze of high-tech equipment, but he didn't have time to analyze it. They had to think fast. One of the masked figures moved toward them, its hand reaching for a syringe. You cannot escape what is coming, it said in a low, monotone voice. Ellie didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby piece of equipment, something sharp and metallic, and threw it at the figure. The figure staggered back, momentarily distracted. Go, Ed. Now, Ellie screamed. Ed didn't wait for another second. He grabbed Ellie's hand and dragged her toward a small service hatch near the back of the room. It was a narrow escape, but it was their only chance. As he pried open the hatch, he saw a dimly lit tunnel beyond. Come on, he said, pulling Ellie into the tunnel just as the masked figures regained their footing and moved toward them. They crawled through the tunnel as quickly as they could, but the sound of pursuit echoed from behind. The narrow space offered no room for escape, only more darkness. But as they pressed on, something began to change. Ed felt a strange sensation creeping up his spine, like they were no longer alone. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping with every step. What's happening? Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Ed replied, but the knot in his stomach told him something was terribly wrong. It's like we're being tracked again. Suddenly, the tunnel ahead lit up with a bright flash, followed by a deep, mechanical growl that reverberated through the walls. A voice, distorted and echoing, crackled through a speaker hidden somewhere in the tunnel. You can't run from what you are. The protocol will find you. The final protocol. Ed froze. The protocol was everywhere. It wasn't just a system. It was alive, and it was hunting them down. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in on them as the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The final protocol had been triggered. The experiment wasn't over. It had only just begun. What do you think the final protocol really is? How will Ed and Ellie survive in this nightmare? What would you do if you were in their shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. The tunnel trembled underfoot, and Ed felt his pulse quicken. The walls, which had once seemed sturdy, now felt fragile as if they could collapse at any moment. The strange voice that echoed through the space sent chills down his spine. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. The final protocol will find you. The words rang in Ed's ears, repeating in a loop that felt endless. They had entered a nightmare, and now they were part of the system. A system that had already anticipated their every move. He had thought he could outrun it, that there was a way to escape. But the tunnel ahead seemed to narrow with every step they took, and the deeper they went, the more claustrophobic it felt. Ellie, breathless and frantic, clutched his arm. What do we do, Ed? We can't just keep running. We don't know where this tunnel leads. He glanced over at her, eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. I don't know, but we can't stop. Not now. There was no time to think. There was no place to hide. The voice had said it all. The protocol was coming. It was already on their trail, and there was nowhere left to run. The tunnel bent sharply ahead, and as they turned the corner, they came face to face with another figure in a dark hood. This time, there was no hesitation. Ed reached for the nearest object, a heavy metal rod lying on the ground, and swung it with everything he had. The figure staggered back, but before they could react, 2 more figures appeared at the end of the corridor, blocking their only way forward. It was clear now, the protocol wasn't just a system. It was a network of operatives designed to eliminate anything in its path. They weren't just being hunted by faceless agents. They were being pursued by an entity that saw them as nothing more than expendable assets. "We're trapped," Ellie gasped, looking over her shoulder at the figures advancing on them. Ed's mind raced. There was no way out of this unless they could outsmart them, unless they could figure out how to hack into the protocol itself. He couldn't believe he was thinking about this now, but it was their only shot. The system was everywhere, and it controlled everything. But what if they could reverse it, exploit the very thing that was hunting them? "Ellie," Ed said urgently, his eyes scanning the walls for anything that could help. "Do you remember the terminal we saw earlier? The one with all the data on it? I think we need to access it now. If we can get to the central hub, maybe we can disable the protocol entirely." Ellie's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "You think it's that simple? We just have to find a way to the heart of this place?" "We don't have a choice," Ed replied, determination in his voice. "We have to try." With no other option, they turned and sprinted down the corridor, desperate to find another way out. The masked figures pursued them, but Ed wasn't looking behind anymore. He was focused entirely on finding the heart of the operation, the place where everything connected. Minutes passed like hours. The tunnel twisted and turned, and they finally reached a massive door, its surface gleaming like polished steel. It was unlike any of the doors they had encountered so far. This one looked secure, protected. Ed didn't hesitate. He approached the door and punched in the code they had stolen from one of the guards earlier. The door hissed open, revealing an expansive control room. Rows of computer screens lined the walls, each one displaying various surveillance feeds and system data. This was it, the central hub. "Ed, we need to be quick," Ellie said, her voice shaking with urgency. "They're right behind us." He nodded, and together, they rushed toward the main terminal at the center of the room. Ed's fingers flew over the keyboard, his mind racing. He was looking for one thing, the protocol's main control system. If he could access it, he could override everything. He could stop it all. But as he started typing, something strange happened. The screen in front of him flickered, and a new message appeared. "Unauthorized access detected. Protocol initiation in progress." Ed froze. "They're on to us," he muttered. "They've been tracking us the whole time. They've known what we were going to do." Ellie's eyes widened in horror. "Then we're too late." "No," Ed replied, shaking his head. "Not yet. There's a way to disrupt the protocol. It's a fail-safe mechanism." He quickly scrolled through the data on the screen, his hands moving faster than ever. He had to be precise. One wrong move, and it would all be over. Ellie, looking over his shoulder, gasped. "Is that it? Can we stop it?" Before Ed could answer, the voice from the intercom crackled again, more urgent this time. "You cannot stop what you have started. Final protocol engaged. Termination in progress." Suddenly, the entire room went dark. The lights flickered and went out, and a low, ominous hum filled the air. A deep, mechanical voice echoed through the speakers, sending a wave of dread through Ed's body. "You have no choice. You will be processed. You will cease to exist." Ellie stepped back, fear written across her face. "Ed, what's happening? What did we trigger?" Ed's mind raced. The central system was no longer just a tool. It had evolved. It was a living, breathing entity now, one that was beyond their control. "We've set something in motion," Ed said, his voice barely audible over the rising hum of the machines. "And we're going to have to live with the consequences." He slammed his fist against the console in frustration, but it was too late. The system was already running on its own. The protocol was no longer a threat. It had become their reality. Do you think Ed and Ellie will be able to fight back against the system now that it has fully engaged? Can they outsmart the protocol, or will they become victims of it? What would you do if you were in their shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. The lights came back on, but it wasn't the same room anymore. The monitors, which had once seemed like mere machines, now emitted an eerie, pulsating glow. The walls seemed to vibrate with an unsettling hum, as though the building itself was alive, aware. Ed could feel the weight of it, the pressure of something vast and intelligent watching them. It wasn't just a system anymore. It had transcended that. They were no longer just playing a game. They were part of a terrifying, larger machine, one that had been in control all along. Ellie looked at Ed, fear in her eyes. Ed, this isn't just a protocol. It's a living entity, isn't it? Ed didn't answer right away. He was too busy watching the central terminal, where the message, termination in progress, flashed in red, followed by a countdown clock that was ticking down with each passing second. He swallowed hard. It was the endgame, and they were running out of time. I think you're right, he said finally, his voice shaking. This isn't just about us. This whole system is designed to grow, to adapt, and to control. It's not something we can simply shut down. Ellie looked around the room, her eyes scanning the myriad of screens. On each, there were different faces, different people. They looked almost like they were being watched. What are they doing to those people? She asked, pointing to the faces on the screens. Ed's heart sank as he realized what Ellie had discovered. The screens weren't just showing surveillance footage. They were showing live feeds of people from all over the world, people who had been caught in the web of the protocol. He moved quickly to the nearest terminal, his fingers flying over the keys, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. These people, they've been tracked by the protocol, just like us. Only they don't even know what's coming for them. Suddenly, the voice from the intercom sounded again, sending a chill through his spine. Subject 12. You have failed. You have triggered irreversible measures. Your fate is sealed. A cold sweat broke out across Ed's forehead. The countdown on the terminal was ticking faster now. Ellie grabbed his arm. Ed, we can't just sit here. We have to do something. We're running out of time. He nodded, desperate to find a way to stop the system, but as he scanned the terminal, his eyes caught something, a hidden file buried deep in the system. The label on it simply read, Final Protocol, Override Access. This is it, Ed said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. If we can get access to this, maybe, just maybe, we can stop it. We can reset the protocol. Without another word, Ed started typing furiously, his mind racing through the steps needed to break into the file. Ellie stood behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the room as the countdown clock continued to tick. The final moments were approaching fast, and they had no idea what would happen when it reached zero. But just as Ed thought he was making progress, the screen flashed once more, and a new message appeared. Access denied. Termination protocol engaged. Ed's heart skipped a beat. The system had already locked them out. It was too late. No, I can't give up now, Ed shouted, slamming his fist against the terminal. Ellie looked at him, eyes wide with terror. What if there's no way out? What if we're just part of the plan now? No, Ed said through gritted teeth. I refuse to believe that. I've seen this before. There's always a way out. There has to be. But as he continued to type, his fingers slower now, something strange happened. The screen flickered, and another message appeared, this time in bold red letters. You have been deceived. You are part of a larger experiment. Subject 12 was never meant to escape. Ed froze. His blood ran cold. They were always watching, he whispered. This wasn't about us getting out. This was never about stopping the protocol. It was about something else. We were chosen. Ellie's face drained of color as she processed the meaning of his words. Chosen? Before Ed could respond, the door behind them slammed shut, the sound of metal locking echoing through the room. They were trapped. In the darkness, they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. From the shadows, a figure stepped into the light. I see you figured it out. The voice was calm, almost amused. Ed's heart stopped. Standing before them was someone he recognized, someone he never expected to see again. No, Ed muttered, his mind reeling. You how? The man before them removed his mask, revealing a familiar face. It was Dr. Westbrook, the scientist who had overseen the experiment at the Institute. He looked the same as he had years ago, but there was something in his eyes, a cold, calculating look that sent a chill down Ed's spine. I'm sorry it had to come to this, Ed, Dr. Westbrook said, his tone unervingly calm. But you see, you were never meant to be free. This was always part of the plan. You were always a test. Ellie gasped. A test? You've been playing with our lives this whole time? Dr. Westbrook nodded. Not just yours. Yours was the final piece. The protocol is now complete. You are the experiment's crowning achievement. Ed's vision blurred with rage. No, we won't be your experiment any longer. We'll destroy it. We'll bring this whole thing down. But Dr. Westbrook smiled, almost pityingly. You misunderstand. The protocol has already won. You cannot stop it. As he spoke, the countdown clock on the terminal reached its final seconds. The lights flickered once more before they went out completely. The room plunged into total darkness. What do you think is Dr. Westbrook's true intention? Is there a way for Ed and Ellie to escape now that they've discovered the truth? What would you do in their situation? Let us know in the comments. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Ed could hear the slow, steady hum of the machines, like a heartbeat, mechanical and unyielding. The lights had gone out completely, but somehow, he could still feel the weight of the room pressing down on them. The silence that followed felt unnatural, suffocating. And then, a sound, footsteps, echoing through the stillness. Ed's heart pounded as he strained to make out the figure of Dr. Westbrook in the dark. His voice came through the shadows, calm, almost comforting. I know this is difficult to understand, but you must accept the truth. Ed's breath caught in his throat. The truth? His voice was low, barely a whisper, his body trembling with a mix of anger and fear. What truth, Westbrook? That we were never meant to be free? That this was all some sick game to you? Dr. Westbrook's voice, though distant, seemed to carry a weight of certainty. The protocol was always meant to evolve. You were part of a much larger experiment, one that transcends you, Ed, and your misguided sense of rebellion. The experiment has run its course, and now there is no way to stop it. The weight of his words pressed on Ed's chest, but his mind refused to submit. He couldn't believe it. They couldn't be the last hope. They couldn't be. No, there has to be a way. There has to be something we missed. A backdoor, a flaw, anything? Ed's voice was raw, desperation creeping in. We are the answer. We can destroy this. We will. We won't let you win. Ellie's voice cut through the tension. Ed, don't. This isn't just about us anymore. He's not going to stop. Her words were softer, trembling with fear, but there was an edge of resignation to them. Maybe it's time we accepted that this is bigger than both of us. No, Ed replied firmly, turning to face her. We are not giving up. I'm not dying for this. We're not dying for this. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the slow whir of the machines around them. Dr. Westbrook's presence loomed larger now, and for the first time, Ed saw something in his eyes, something that looked almost like pity. You misunderstand, Ed, Westbrook said, his tone chilling. You were always meant to be a part of the protocol. You were never supposed to escape. Your only purpose was to trigger the final step. And now that it's complete, I no longer have any need for you. Ellie gasped, realizing the terrible truth. So that's it? We're just expendable? Dr. Westbrook's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. You were never meant to be saved. The countdown clock on the terminal began its final sequence, its relentless ticking like the sound of a death knell. Ed could feel his stomach churn as he watched the seconds slip away. This is it, isn't it? Ed muttered to himself, his voice a mix of disbelief and acceptance. We're too late. There's no way to stop it now. Dr. Westbrook's voice, suddenly hollow and detached, answered him. It's already over, Ed. You've already played your part. Now, you will cease to exist, just like everyone else who came before you. Ed's hands clenched into fists, but there was no fight left in him. Not now. The dark truth hung heavy in the air, the finality of it suffocating him. He was no longer sure of anything. The reality he had believed in, the possibility of escape, of resistance, had been an illusion. What happens now? Ellie whispered, as if speaking to herself more than anyone else. The answer came in the form of a high-pitched screech, followed by an unnatural silence. And then, a mechanical voice once again filled the room. Protocol complete. Subject 12. Final sequence initiated. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a sudden rush of air seemed to pulse through the room. It wasn't a feeling of escape. It was something more, a feeling of inevitability. The room they stood in no longer felt real. It was as if the world around them had started to shift, like reality itself was being rewritten in real time. Ellie took a hesitant step back. What's happening? What are you doing? It's too late to stop it now. Westbrook's voice had turned cold and emotionless, as if he were speaking to a malfunctioning machine rather than a human being. This is the beginning of the end. This is your purpose. Your bodies will be reprocessed. The final phase of the protocol will be complete, and humanity will be reshaped. Ed's mind raced as he thought of all the people trapped in the system, the ones whose lives had been hijacked, whose fates had been sealed long before. But then he thought of Ellie, standing beside him, and the small, fragile hope that still flickered in his chest. The countdown hit 0, and then everything stopped. For a split second, there was complete silence. The world around them felt frozen in place, as if time itself had ceased to exist. Then, the lights flickered back on, but what Ed saw next was beyond anything he could have prepared for. The walls of the room were no longer the sterile, metallic surfaces they had known. Instead, the entire room had transformed. It looked like something out of a dream or a nightmare. There were no doors, no windows. The floor was covered in a strange, glowing material pulsing with light, as if it were alive. What is this? Ellie whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around in horror. Dr. Westbrook's voice came through the air once more, soft and mocking. This is the new world, Ed. The new reality. And you are nothing but a remnant of the old. Ed took a step forward, eyes scanning the strange new environment. No, his voice was weak, but resolute. We're not just remnants. We're still alive. We still have a chance. But as the strange light in the room continued to pulse, Ed realized the terrifying truth. It wasn't just the world that had changed. They had too. What do you think happened to Ed and Ellie? Are they still the same, or have they been altered by the protocol? Can they find a way to fight back in this new world? What would you do if you were in their position? Share your thoughts with us. Ed stood frozen, his eyes tracing the strange, pulsating walls. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The once familiar, sterile environment had transformed into something otherworldly, alien. The glowing floor beneath them seemed to shimmer like liquid light, moving in waves that made Ed feel dizzy. The air was thick with a hum, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate deep in his bones. Ellie was standing beside him, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide as she stared at the transformation. She reached out, her fingers grazing the strange material underfoot, as if hoping it would offer some clue about what was happening to them. This isn't real, Ellie whispered, almost to herself. This can't be real. But Ed knew better. He could feel it. This was no dream. This was something far worse. They were trapped, inside something that wasn't just a room, but a new reality. A loud thud broke the silence, followed by the sound of something metallic scraping against the glowing floor. Ed spun around to see a new figure emerging from the shadows, its silhouette shifting like a shadow in the light. Westbrook! Ed shouted, his voice shaking. What have you done to us? The figure stepped forward, and to Ed's horror, it wasn't just Dr. Westbrook standing before them. It was an echo of him. His face was distorted, his features flickering between human and something else, something that looked wrong. You were never meant to understand, the figure intoned, its voice warped, as if speaking through a mechanical filter. The protocol was only the beginning. You are part of a grander design now. You've crossed into the next phase. Ellie's breath hitched. The next phase, what does that even mean? The figure's eyes glowed faintly, as if seeing them for the first time. It means you are no longer simply human. You are becoming part of the protocol. Every moment you breathe, you are changing. This is not just a place. It is a process. You are evolving, just like the system. Ed could feel his legs growing weak beneath him. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers, but his mind was reeling. The very fabric of his reality was breaking apart. Was he losing his mind? Was this what it felt like to be trapped in a nightmare with no escape? I won't accept this, Ed said, his voice trembling with defiance. I will fight. I'll fight until the end. The figure tilted its head, its distorted smile growing wider. There is no fight left, Ed. You are already beyond fighting. You are already becoming one with the system. Ellie took a step back, her eyes darting around the room. No, there has to be a way out of here. We can't just let this happen. The figure seemed to laugh softly, a sound that sent chills down their spines. It's too late for escape. This room is no longer bound by the rules of your world. There are no doors, no exits. You are part of the experiment now. And once you're inside, there is only one way forward. Integration. Ed's mind raced. Integration? What did that even mean? He could feel his heart pounding harder, the fear creeping in. Integration with what? He demanded. What are you turning us into? But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The room fell into an oppressive silence once again. The hum of the machines grew louder, as if to fill the empty space where the figure had been. Ellie reached out to grab Ed's arm. Ed, we need to figure out what's happening to us. We can't just stand here. We need answers. But Ed barely heard her. His mind was racing, each thought tumbling over the last. He looked down at his hands, his own hands, and suddenly, they seemed so foreign, as if they didn't belong to him anymore. He rubbed them together, trying to feel something solid, something real, but the sensation was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. Ellie, Ed whispered, his voice trembling, do you feel it? Something's happening to us. It's like we're changing, becoming something else. Ellie looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. I feel it too, Ed. I don't know what it is, but it's like we're merging with this place. Like the protocol is inside us, rewriting us. Ed's throat tightened as he tried to swallow the panic rising in his chest. Was it true? Were they no longer just human? Were they becoming part of the very system they had tried to escape from? Before they could process any more, the room around them began to warp. The walls stretched and bent in unnatural angles, the glowing floor pulsing faster, the light growing brighter until it was blinding. Ed and Ellie clutched each other, their bodies trembling as the reality they knew seemed to collapse in on itself. And then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The light faded. The walls straightened. The room returned to its original form, but it was empty, silent. The monitors that had once filled the space with data were now completely blank. The terminals, once alive with movement, stood still. We're alone, Ellie whispered, her voice cracking. But Ed wasn't sure. Something felt off, too quiet, too still. The air felt thicker, like they were breathing through a veil. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. Not even the distorted figure of Westbrook remained. It doesn't feel right, Ed muttered. I think we're inside the system now. Somehow, we've been absorbed into it. Ellie's face was pale, her eyes haunted. And if we've been absorbed, does that mean we're already gone? That we're not even alive anymore? Ed shook his head, refusing to believe it. No, we're still here. We're still us. We're not whatever this place is trying to make us. But as he spoke, a strange sensation washed over him, a sudden clarity. He realized he could hear things, voices, far off, like whispers in a crowd. They weren't his own thoughts. They weren't even Ellie's. They were coming from somewhere else. Do you hear that? Ed asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ellie nodded slowly, her eyes wide. I hear it. It's like the protocol is alive. It's speaking to us. We're not alone anymore, Ed. The system is in our heads. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They were never just trapped in a room anymore. They had become part of the system itself, and it was never going to let them go. Do you think Ed and Ellie are still human? How do you think the system is changing them? Can they still fight back? Or have they already lost their identity? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. The silence in the room was oppressive, but it was broken by a new sensation. A pulse, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat that seemed to reverberate in Ed's chest. He pressed a hand to his ribcage, as if trying to quell the unnatural rhythm. Ellie's voice broke through the silence, but it sounded distant, as if she were speaking from the far end of a tunnel. Ed, do you think we've been reprogrammed? Ed shook his head slowly, the weight of the question sinking in. I don't know. It's like we're connected to it now. Like the protocol is inside us, reaching into our thoughts, our very essence. His voice cracked, fear creeping into his words. If it is, we don't even know who we are anymore. Ellie stepped back, her hands trembling as she touched her temples. It's like there's someone else in my head, she whispered. I can hear voices, too many voices. They're all them. All the people who've been part of the protocol. They're all speaking at once. Ed's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The idea was maddening. Was she right? Were they becoming part of something far larger than themselves? Were they now just data, part of a vast, cold machine, lost in the sea of countless others who had already been absorbed? He tried to focus, to push away the creeping fear, but the pulse was becoming louder, more insistent. It wasn't just in his chest anymore. It was in his mind. Like a drumbeat, the pulse was amplifying, drowning out everything else. His thoughts began to blur. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, his body suddenly heavy, like he was sinking into something that wasn't solid ground. Ed. Ellie's voice broke through again, sharper this time. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back into focus. Ed, listen to me. We can't let it take us. Whatever this is, whatever's happening, we have to fight it. He turned toward her, his eyes clouded with confusion. But how? How do we fight something that's already inside us? Ellie's eyes were wide with panic, but there was a hint of resolve in them too. I don't know, but we have to try. If we lose ourselves to this thing, we're nothing. We'll just be part of it. We have to fight to stay human. Ed's heart raced. Her words were a lifeline, the last thread of hope in a world that had gone dark. But his mind was struggling to keep up. The pulse, the voices, everything seemed to be pulling him under, dragging him into the depths of something far more terrifying than he could comprehend. What if it's too late, Ellie? What if we're already lost? Ellie shook her head firmly. We aren't lost. We're still us. And we're not going down without a fight. Ed nodded slowly, drawing on every ounce of willpower he had left. They had come so far. There had to be a way to resist, to break free. As if on cue, the hum of the machines began to grow louder, more invasive. The walls seemed to close in on them, flickering with strange symbols. Symbols that made Ed's skin crawl. The room felt alive now, more like a living organism than a place. The pulse was coming from inside the walls, inside the very fabric of the room. We have to find the source, Ed said, his voice steady but filled with determination. There has to be a central hub, something controlling all of this. If we can find it, maybe we can shut it down. Ellie looked around, her eyes scanning the now unfamiliar room. But how? Where do we even start? Before Ed could answer, the lights flickered again, and a new voice echoed through the room, cold and mechanical. It was unmistakably Dr. Westbrook's voice, though distorted, almost unrecognizable. You can try to fight it, Ed, but you won't win. The system is far too advanced. You are already part of it, and the more you resist, the more you become a part of the whole. The voice was everywhere, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. It wasn't just spoken. It felt like it was inside them, weaving through their thoughts, eroding their will to fight. Ellie clutched her head, her body racked with a sudden tremor. No, I won't let it. I won't let it win. Ed grabbed her hands, his grip tight. You can't give in, Ellie. We have to stay strong. We can't let him take us. He's lying. He has to be. But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. The pulse was stronger now, louder, filling his thoughts. What if Westbrook was right? What if this was the end for them? As the pulse grew louder, Ed felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the room warping. He could feel himself warping, like his very essence was being rewritten, his memories becoming clouded, slipping away. The fear was overwhelming, but the desperation kept him from succumbing completely. No, he whispered to himself. I'm still here. I'm still me. Ellie's voice cut through the dark fog of his mind. We have to find the source, Ed, before it's too late. She was right. If they were to have any chance of survival, they needed to find the central hub controlling the system. They needed to sever the connection before they became nothing but pawns in a machine that had already claimed so many before them. Let's move, Ed said, his voice gaining strength. We have to find it. Now. They began to move through the room, their eyes darting around for any sign of an exit or a control panel. But it was impossible to ignore the constant pulse, the voices that filled their minds, the feeling that the very room was alive and watching them. How do we even know where to look? Ellie asked, her voice filled with frustration. Everything's so wrong. But Ed wasn't listening to her anymore. His eyes had landed on something. Something faint, barely visible, but there, at the far end of the room, in the corner where the walls seemed to distort, there was a small panel, glowing faintly. It wasn't much, but it was their only lead. We start there, Ed said, determination flaring in his eyes. That's our chance. As they made their way toward the panel, the pulse grew louder, as if the very room was trying to stop them. But Ed pushed forward, refusing to be swallowed by the darkness. They were close, too close to give up now. What do you think is at the end of the tunnel for Ed and Ellie? Can they overcome the system's influence? Or are they doomed to become part of it forever? What would you do if you were in their shoes? Share your thoughts below. The room had become a battleground. Each step that Ed and Ellie took felt like they were marching through a war zone. An invisible war fought inside their minds. The pulse, relentless and deafening, throbbed in sync with their heartbeats, a constant reminder of the power that sought to claim them. The walls seemed to close in with every second, the air thick with tension. Their feet moved instinctively, drawn toward the faint glow of the panel at the far end of the room. Ed's mind raced. Is this it? Is this where it all ends? Or is this where we start our fight? The closer they got, the more intense the pressure became. The hum of the machines was deafening now, vibrating through the very floor beneath them. Ellie reached for Ed's hand, her grip tight, as if holding onto something solid in a world that was unraveling. We're almost there, Ed muttered, though his voice was barely audible over the noise. Ellie didn't respond, her gaze fixed ahead, her body tense. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, as if fighting against some unseen force. The voices in her head were louder now, overwhelming her. They came in waves, crashing against her thoughts. They're trying to drown me, Ed. I can't. Focus, Ellie, Ed urged, his voice firm but compassionate. We're almost there. We just have to reach that panel. That's our chance. But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. What if it was too late? What if the panel wasn't the answer, but another trap? They had already been manipulated by Westbrook, had fallen into his hands once before. Could they trust anything in this place? They reached the panel, and Ed's heart pounded in his chest. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he placed his hand on the surface, feeling the vibrations under his fingertips. It was warm to the touch, too warm. The energy emanating from it felt alive. Do you think this is it? Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Ed said, looking around. The room seemed to pulse in sync with the panel, the walls vibrating, the air thick with static. But we have to try. He took another breath, steadying his nerves, and pressed a button on the panel. Immediately, the entire room seemed to shift. The walls seemed to dissolve, the air around them rippling as though reality itself was bending. The pulse that had been deafening them suddenly stopped, leaving only a hollow, eerie silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice, cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of empathy, spoke. You should have known better, Ed. Resistance is futile. You are part of the system now. The voice was unmistakably Dr. Westbrook's. His image flickered on a screen that appeared out of nowhere, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of swirling code. His face was unnervingly calm, as if everything had gone according to plan. Welcome to the core, Ed, Ellie. His voice dripped with mockery. You've done well to come this far, but you're too late. Ed clenched his fists, his blood boiling with anger. You won't win, Westbrook. We'll find a way to stop this. Westbrook's smile twisted, a cold, knowing expression. Stop it? You've already given me everything I need. You and Ellie are the final pieces of the puzzle. You think you're fighting me, but you've been helping me all along. Everything you've done, every step you've taken, has been part of the plan. Ed's mind reeled. What was he saying? How could they have been part of the plan? You've been programmed, Ed, Ellie too. You've been rewired from the inside. You're not who you think you are. Westbrook's voice was like a knife cutting through Ed's thoughts, each word sharp and precise. But that's okay, because once you embrace it, once you accept your place in the system, you'll understand. You'll see that this is the only way forward. Ellie's breath quickened. Her body was trembling violently now, and her voice was barely a whisper. Ed, I don't think I can fight this anymore. Ed turned to her, his heart aching at the sight of her fragile state. She was slipping. They were both slipping. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their very identities, their humanity. I won't let you go, Ellie, Ed said fiercely, grabbing her hands. We can still fight. We can still fight back. Westbrook's figure on the screen flickered again, and his voice grew colder. You don't understand, Ed. You're too far gone. The protocol is already part of you. It's embedded in your thoughts, your memories. The more you resist, the more you'll become part of it. But don't worry, soon, you'll forget about all this. You'll forget about me, about everything. And when you wake up, you'll be part of the new world. The world that I control. Ellie's face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped Ed's arms. Ed, he's right. I feel it. It's taking over. I can't stop it. I can't fight it anymore. Yes, you can, Ed said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. We can fight this. We're stronger than this. We're still us. But as he spoke, the lights in the room flickered again, and the walls around them began to shift. The space seemed to bend, twisting and warping, as if they were being pulled into another dimension, another reality. The pulse started again, softer now, but still relentless, like the steady thrum of a heartbeat. Ellie, Ed said urgently, we have to make a choice. This is our moment. We either break the system now, or we become part of it, for good. Ellie looked into his eyes, her gaze filled with both fear and determination. I can't do it alone, Ed. Please, help me. Ed held her hands tighter, his resolve hardening. I'm right here, Ellie. We're in this together. We will fight until the very end. The moment stretched on, and for a split second, Ed felt the world collapse around him. The voices, the pulse, Westbrook's taunting words, it all felt like a dream, a nightmare. But this was real, and this was their fight. They had come too far to turn back now. With a single, final breath, Ed pushed against the pull of the system, willing himself and Ellie to resist. They had one chance to reclaim their lives, their minds. One chance to break free. What would you do in Ed and Ellie's position? Would you be able to resist the system, or would you too be consumed by it? Let us know in the comments below. The room was closing in on them. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second, charged with the hum of technology, with the sinister force that was Westbrook's creation. Ellie's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling as if she were fighting to stay afloat in an ocean of darkness. The weight of the system's control was pressing on her, pulling at her very thoughts. Ed, Ellie whispered, her voice cracked. I can't hold on. It's too much. Ed's eyes burned with urgency. He could see the battle inside her, her mind torn between the person she was and the cold machinery that wanted to swallow her whole. He could feel it, too. The temptation of the system's promises, the order, the power, the certainty. But they couldn't give in. We will hold on, Ed said, more to himself than to Ellie, but his words carried a weight that pulled her back from the brink. We fought this far, Ellie. We won't lose now. But the pressure on them was overwhelming. The pulse from the panel reverberated through their bodies, each beat shaking them, testing their resolve. Westbrook's voice, cold and calculated, seemed to grow louder in the air, as if it was seeping into their very souls. It's no use, Ed. You've already lost. This is the way forward. The way of progress. You should be grateful. You should thank me. You'll see the beauty of it once you're part of the system. Your struggles, your emotions, they're the last remnants of a dying world. All of this chaos, it's unnecessary. You're wasting your time. Ed clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He could hear Westbrook's words, but they were like the distant echoes of a past he was determined to leave behind. No, I won't give up. Not now. Not ever. You're wrong, Westbrook, Ed shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. This isn't progress. It's control. It's tyranny. You may think you've won, but I won't let you have Ellie. I won't let you have me. Westbrook's image on the screen flickered, his eyes narrowing as he watched them struggle. How naive, Ed. You think you have a choice? You think this is a fight worth having? You're already part of the system. The more you fight, the more you cement your place within it. Resistance is futile. Ellie shook her head, her hands trembling in Ed's grip. I don't want to lose myself, Ed. I don't want to become that. Her voice broke, a sob escaping her throat as she pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the invading thoughts. Ed's heart ached for her, the woman he had come to care for, the woman he had sworn to protect. How can I help her? The question ran through his mind like a mantra. He couldn't allow this to happen. Not to Ellie. Not to himself. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for anything they could use to fight back. The panel at the far end of the room was still glowing, pulsing with that same energy. But there had to be a way to disrupt it. There had to be a way to break the connection. Ellie, he said, his voice urgent, focus on the panel. It's the source of the signal, the source of all this control. If we can break it, you're wasting your time, Westbrook interjected, his voice like a knife, cold and unyielding. It's already too late. You've already become part of the code. You'll see, Ed. You'll see that there's no going back now. Ed's mind raced. Was it really too late? Could they still escape the system's grasp? He had to believe they could. They had to. Ellie, we can't let him win. This is the last chance we have, Ed said, his voice low but steady, grounding her. We have to tear it down. The panel, the code, it's all tied together. If we break the link between us and it, we break the system. We break him. Ellie looked at him, her eyes filled with fear, but also something else. Something that reminded Ed of the person she used to be, the person she still was deep inside. Strength, determination, hope. She nodded, though it was clear how much it cost her. Let's do it. Together, they moved toward the glowing panel. Each step was a battle, every footfall feeling like an eternity, but they kept moving. As they approached the panel, the room seemed to pulse harder, as if the very walls were closing in on them. The lights flickered, and a deep rumble filled the air. You're too late. Westbrook's voice was a hiss now, almost mocking. Do you really think you can just turn it off? That you can escape your fate? It's already embedded in you. You're not who you were anymore. This is who you are now. This is who you'll always be. Ed ignored the voice, his focus solely on the panel. He could feel the energy radiating from it, could sense the code that had been embedded in their minds, the code that had been manipulating them, controlling them. He reached forward, his fingers brushing the surface of the panel. Ellie took a deep breath and pressed her hand to the panel next to his. In that instant, the world seemed to shudder. The energy in the room intensified, pushing back against them like an invisible force. But Ed didn't pull away. Instead, he gripped the panel with both hands, focusing all his energy into it. Now, he yelled, break it. Together, they pushed against the panel with every ounce of strength they had left. And then, with a crack that seemed to tear the air itself, the panel shattered, a burst of light flooding the room. The pulse that had been controlling them stopped dead in its tracks. The walls stopped vibrating. The air cleared. For a moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then, slowly, Ellie exhaled, her body sagging against Ed as the tension seemed to drain out of her. We did it, she whispered, her voice hoarse. We did it. But as the dust settled, they both knew that the battle was far from over. Westbrook's image flickered one last time on the screen, a twisted smile still etched on his face. You think you've won? You think you've broken the system? No, Ed. No, Ellie. You've just begun. The system was still out there. But this time, they were ready. What do you think is next for Ed and Ellie? Do they truly have a chance to fight the system? Or will they be forever trapped in its web? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.